Vietnam War Caves Tragedy of the Eight Ladies. During the 1960s and 1970s, the United States military unleashed one of the heaviest bombing campaigns in history over Vietnam. The operation known as Rolling Thunder dropped millions of tons of bombs on North Vietnamese supply routes and villages. To survive the endless bombardment, the Vietnamese people did something extraordinary. They moved their lives underground. Across the provinces of Quang Binh and Quang Tri, entire communities disappeared into vast networks of caves and tunnels. The famous Vinh Moc tunnels were dug by hand into clay and rock to hide an entire village beneath the earth. These were not simple hiding holes. They were underground cities with kitchens, sleeping quarters, a 10-bed hospital, and even a small theater. Families were born, lived, and died inside these tunnels, while bombs shook the ground above them every single day. Further inland, the caves of the Phong Nhat limestone mountains became shelters for soldiers and volunteers working on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The trail was a lifeline, a secret network of roads that carried soldiers, weapons, and supplies from north to south through the jungle. American bombers targeted the trail constantly, destroying roads as fast as the Vietnamese could rebuild them. To keep the trail open, the North Vietnamese army sent thousands of young volunteers deep into the mountains. Many of them were women, some barely 18 years old, sent from their home provinces to repair bomb craters on the roads. On Road 20, one of the most heavily bombed stretches of the trail, a group of 8 young women from Thanh Hoa province were stationed at a small cave. The cave was known as Hang Tam Ko, the Cave of the Eight Ladies. The women were aged between 18 and 20, and their job was to fill bomb craters and keep the road open for military trucks. They lived in the cave and worked in rotating shifts, repairing the road by day and sheltering underground when the bombers came. On November 14, 1972, American fighter jets launched another massive bombing raid on the Road 20 area. The 8 young women ran into their cave to take shelter, just as they had done many times before. Bombs struck the hillside one after another, shaking the ground like an earthquake. Then a direct hit near the cave entrance sent a colossal slab of rock crashing down over the only way in or out. The 8 women were sealed inside, buried alive behind tons of solid stone. Soldiers stationed nearby heard their screams echoing through the cracks in the rock. 3 bulldozers were brought in to try to move the massive stone, but nothing could shift it. They considered using explosives, but a blast would have killed the women trapped inside. Desperate rescuers pushed a plastic pipe through the tiny gaps in the rock and poured soup and water into it. But they had no way of knowing if the liquid ever reached the women on the other side. Day after day, the cries for help continued, growing weaker with each passing hour. On the 9th day, the voices from inside the cave went silent. All 8 young women had perished in the darkness, sealed behind a wall of stone. Habbaniyah Desert Caves, years-long survival. In 2014, a terror group known as ISIS swept across western Iraq and seized control of entire cities in the Anbar province. Hundreds of thousands of families were forced to flee their homes in cities like Fallujah and Ramadi almost overnight. Some escaped to displacement camps, some crammed into abandoned buildings, but others had nowhere to go at all. In the remote desert cliffs near Habbaniyah, hundreds of desperate families found a different kind of shelter. They climbed into ancient caves carved into the rocky hillsides, some natural, some carved by human hands centuries ago. These caves had no electricity, no running water, and no connection to the outside world. But they were hidden, and in a war zone, being hidden meant being alive. Families dragged whatever they could carry: blankets, cooking pots, plastic sheeting, and small bags of food. They hung plastic sheets over the cave entrances to block the desert wind and the blowing sand. Inside, they built small cooking fires on the cave floors to prepare whatever scraps of food they had. But the caves had almost no ventilation, and the smoke from those fires had nowhere to go. Within weeks, children and elderly family members began developing severe breathing problems from inhaling smoke every single day. Coughing fits echoed through the caves at night, and there were no doctors and no medicine anywhere nearby. The desert heat during the day was brutal, often reaching over 50 degrees Celsius. At night, the temperature dropped sharply, and the cold crept into the stone walls like ice. But the worst problem of all was water. The nearest water sources were miles away across open desert terrain. Every trip to collect water was a journey that could end in death. ISIS snipers watched the open ground, and the desert was scattered with IEDs, hidden bombs buried just beneath the sand. Fathers and older sons had to walk for miles carrying plastic containers, never knowing if they would make it back. Some did not. Families who lost their water carriers had to rely on the kindness of neighboring cave dwellers to share what little they had. There was almost no food either. Families survived on small amounts of bread, rice, and whatever could be found or traded. Children grew thin and weak, and the sound of crying babies filled the caves through the long desert nights. Months turned into a year, and then 2 years, and still the war raged on outside. Some families lived in those caves for nearly 3 years, watching their children grow up in darkness and dust. They created a community out of nothing, sharing food, watching each other's children, and keeping each other alive. When Iraqi forces finally reclaimed the territory from ISIS, aid workers began reaching these remote areas. What they found shocked them. Entire families living like ancient cave dwellers in the 21st century. Saipan Cave's mass tragedy of 1944. On June 15, 1944, 20,000 United States Marines stormed the beaches of Saipan, a small island in the Pacific Ocean held by Japan. The island was home to around 30,000 Japanese civilians, many of whom had come from Okinawa to work the sugarcane fields. When the bombing and shelling began, thousands of terrified families grabbed whatever they could carry and ran north. They fled into the vast network of limestone caves hidden beneath the mountains and cliffs of the island. Mothers carried babies, fathers dragged elderly parents, and children clung to whatever adult was closest. Deep inside the caves, entire families huddled together in total darkness, listening to the explosions shaking the ground above them. They believed the caves would keep them safe until the fighting was over. But the Japanese military had filled their heads with terrifying lies about the Americans. Propaganda had told them that American soldiers would torture, rape, and even eat Japanese civilians if they were captured. Families who might have surrendered chose to stay hidden underground instead, too afraid to come out. In some caves, Japanese soldiers forced civilians to stay inside and use them as human shields against the advancing Marines. Women and children were kept at the front of the caves, while armed soldiers hid behind them. As the Marines pushed northward through the island, they encountered hundreds of caves filled with enemy fighters. The problem was brutal and simple. They had no way of knowing who was inside. Marines began clearing the caves using flamethrowers that shot streams of burning fuel deep into the darkness. They also threw in satchel charges, powerful bundles of explosives that collapsed entire cave systems in seconds. Inside many of those caves, hundreds of innocent civilians were hiding just meters from the entrance. Entire families were killed by fire, and explosions meant for soldiers they were trapped with. The screams that echoed from inside those caves would haunt the Marines who heard them for the rest of their lives. As the weeks dragged on, the Japanese were pushed into the northern tip of the island, with nowhere left to go. On the evening of July 6th, Japanese General Yoshitsugu Saito ordered every remaining soldier and civilian to die with honor rather than surrender. The next morning, over 3,000 Japanese soldiers launched a massive suicide charge straight into the American lines. Nearly all of them were killed, but the horror did not end there. In the days that followed, hundreds of Japanese civilians walked to the edges of the towering cliffs at the northern tip of the island. Mothers held their children and jumped from a 600-foot cliff into the ocean below. Fathers threw their families off before jumping themselves. Some shouted banzai as they fell, wishing the emperor 10,000 years of life. American soldiers stood at the top with bullhorns, begging them in Japanese to stop, promising they would be treated well. But most did not listen, and the bodies piled up on the rocks and in the water below. Cueva de los Verdes pirate fortress survival. For hundreds of years, the people of Lanzarote and the Canary Islands lived in constant fear of what was coming from the sea. The island sat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, directly in the path of pirate ships and North African slave traders. Raiding parties from the Barbary Coast attacked the island again and again throughout the 1500s and 1600s. They came to steal livestock, plunder homes, and drag men, women, and children away into slavery. The people of Lanzarote had no navy, no army, and no stone fortress to protect them. But they had something the pirates did not know about: a massive underground tunnel hidden beneath the volcanic landscape. The tunnel was called Cueva de los Verdes, and it stretched nearly 8 kilometers through the earth from the volcano La Corona all the way to the Atlantic coast. It had been formed thousands of years earlier when a volcanic eruption sent a river of lava flowing underground, leaving behind a hollow tube of solid rock. The tunnel was enormous. In some places, it reached 50 meters high and 15 meters wide. It twisted and branched into a maze of overlapping galleries, vertical shafts, and hidden chambers that no outsider could navigate. The people of the Harrowing region turned this natural wonder into the most effective hiding place in the entire Atlantic. Whenever scouts on the hilltop spotted pirate sails on the horizon, the alarm would spread across the villages in minutes. Every man, woman, and child would grab whatever they could carry and run for the cave entrance. They brought sacks of grain, containers of water, hand-powered grain mills, and even their farm animals, goats, donkeys, and chickens. Everything they needed to survive for weeks was dragged underground into the darkness. Once inside, the villagers disappeared into the labyrinth, moving deep into chambers that no torch could reach from the surface. They hung sheets of cloth to block light and sound, and they prayed together in the darkness for the pirates to leave. On the surface, the pirates would arrive to find empty villages with no sign of where the people had gone. Some raiding parties tried to enter the cave to find them, but the tunnel system was their death trap. The locals knew every turn, every drop, and every dead end inside the lava tube. Pirates who wandered into the maze became hopelessly lost in the total darkness. According to local legend, some of those pirates never found their way back out. The villagers could wait underground for days or even weeks until their scouts confirmed that the pirate ships had finally sailed away. One of the most brutal raids in the island's history came in 1618, when the notorious pirates Taban Arayes and Soliman attacked Lanzarote with devastating force. They burned buildings, looted everything they could find, and hunted for people to capture as slaves. But the people of Habbaniyah had already vanished underground into the Cueva de los Verdes. They lived inside the lava tube for 2 full months while the pirates searched the island above them. The pirates eventually gave up and sailed away, and the villagers emerged from the darkness to rebuild their lives once again. This pattern repeated itself for over 200 years. Attack, flee, survive, rebuild. If this story kept you on edge, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a cave story. Every week, we go deeper into the world's most terrifying caves, where darkness hides stories no one was meant to tell. Until next time, stay out of the dark.